Hello. All right, so as I mentioned in the email, we're talking about social movements and interest groups. So we've talked about social movements before, especially the night of the exam, where we talked about, we had watched the suffragette movie, and we had, in the next class, and we had done the analysis of the tactics. Well, so I just wanted to summarize this as an introduction to the lecture on interest groups. So social movements are big, broad groups that use popular participation to influence the government. So they're trying to get a whole bunch of people involved to get something out of government. And usually they're not very formal. And that's going to be a good contrast to interest groups, which are very, very formal, typically. And of course, social movements can be made up of everybody, different institutions, different people, and interest groups as well. So they're broad coalitions of different entities, and they're especially trying to get excluded people or people who are excluded from certain political privileges to get included. So they're fighting for inclusion or rights that aren't normally recognized. And ultimately, what we talked about is, why do they succeed? Well, they succeed because they overcome the collective dilemmas, specifically the collective action problem. They are trying to make sure, get everyone to, quote unquote, not free ride, but to do their part to get that benefit, to get that inclusion that they're aiming for. And if you remember, we had this equation, the paradox of participation, paradox of voting, but also works for participation. And the ultimate departure from this, takeaway from this, is that for someone to participate in something, they need to see their participation as impactful. It has to have a high probability of succeeding, or the benefit has to be sufficiently large to outweigh the costs. All right, that's going to be very important, because that's a number one reason why many people don't participate in a social movement, is because either my single act of participation doesn't matter, or the benefits that I get directly therefrom are not going to outweigh the cost. And so what gets people to overcome that? We talked about this before. Their group attachment. So maybe their racial group or their gender group that might motivate them, say, in spite of the fact that I don't get a whole lot of it, my group will get a whole lot out of it, or people like me will get a whole lot out of it, so they do it. We also saw that sometimes there are entrepreneurs, people who take the lead to make sure that, to pay the early costs so that the cost for everybody else is pretty easy. And so they lower that cost. It can be media, it can be individuals. And those people, those entrepreneurs, they do it because they get that large benefit. Being the pioneer, getting the social recognition, the historical recognition. All right? And then they also, social movements get this done by offering benefits to the people who take part. So they can they can provide information, they can provide actual assistance, material assistance, they can be social, or they can just be furthering the goal, which for many people is benefit in and of itself. And that once these groups get large, based on the size of that group, then they can persuade members of government, especially if their group is large compared to the margin of victory for that elected official, they can get that elected official to pay attention to them. So this is especially a good segue to interest groups, because interest groups, while they're not as large as social movements, nevertheless, and often aren't even membership groups to begin with, nevertheless they do provide some of this type of activity in terms of benefits to those who partake in the interest group. Interest groups in particular, that benefit that they're looking for out of government often is the motivation or is the benefit that the members of that interest group are looking for. So it's not necessarily I get benefits just because I'm part of this group. It's I'm looking for this thing from government and I join this group in order to get it. So that's more the motivation, if you will, of interest groups. All right, and they tend to be very formal around that goal. They may exist broadly, as in the example of an industrial interest group. The American Association of Manufacturers represents really any manufacturer out there. But nevertheless, one of the things that that group is supposed to accomplish is the furthering of policy goals of manufacturers. So getting government to do what those manufacturers want them to do. But interest groups in general is birthed out of a fundamental theory called pluralism. And that is that individuals don't really interact with government as an individual. They interact with government as through a group. And interest groups is just another name for the types of groups that people might join. One thing to recognize that depending on what system of government, or actually I shouldn't say system, level of government or even institution of government, you have a series of interest groups that are around them. We call the interest group ecology around that institution of government. So whether you're talking about Congress, whether you're talking about president, whether you're talking about judiciary or the Supreme Court, or even if you're talking about at the state level or municipal levels, each institution has its ecology of interest groups. And when you look at those ecologies, you find this characteristic, that almost 2/3 of them, the interest groups are in that ecology, represent financial interests. So these are business interest groups, these are professional associations, so association of nurses, if you will, or association of what would you call it, sanitation workers, but some type of financial interest. They're organized around that interest, that financial interest. And then the other third is usually some mix of labor interests, labor being different than the professional interest. Labor is much more trying to secure workplace benefits than some of the professional associations, which are slightly different. So for example, the American Association of Architects is a professional association, but they're not a labor union because they're not trying to negotiate salaries on behalf of the architects, if that's an example for you. But anyway, they're a mix of labor and of public-oriented interest groups. So there can be interest groups that are not necessarily looking for a financial payoff. There are interest groups that are actually advocating on the sometimes financial interests of others, especially the poor or the downtrodden in some kind of way, those needing medical assistance even. So you have a lot of interest groups oriented around environmental policy, some organized around medical research, things like that. One truism, just like we saw with voting, just like we saw with other forms of participation, so you see with interest groups. The people who participate in interest groups tend to be middle to upper income. The poor are not often involved in interest groups. Don't have the resources, don't have the knowledge, typically not involved. So you're seeing the upper and the middle classes involved in interest groups. So we're going to focus primarily on the 2/3 that are financial interests because they play a huge role in our society. So this whole lecture, really, you could characterize it as business interest groups, and that we're going to focus on. And one of the major questions with businesses in general is the question of regulation. All right. And regulation is just that simple term for trying to capture how the government, if you will, tries to shape the behavior of these businesses. How they try to get them to do the things that government would like them to do. You would say society would like them to do. I'm just going to say government at this point. We'll keep going from there. All right, and there are 3 perspectives at which to evaluate or to look at regulation. Forgive me, this is not going to come up in order, but you have regulation as competition. You have, regulation as enforcement, regulation as competition, and then regulation as subsidy. All right, we're going to cover all 3, but I'm just giving you the 3 from the beginning. Let's start with regulation as competition. So taking us back to what we talked about before, and the reason why I'm focused on business interest groups is because businesses have a privileged position in our society. If you remember the lecture on the economy, we noted how in that economic model, and I'm going to bring that up in a moment, businesses, we leave in a free market system, or a market system, I shouldn't say free market. In a market system, we leave the investment decisions primarily to business. And then politics gets involved trying to curb or direct or even motivate sometimes the behavior of these, the investment of these entrepreneurs. Alexander Hamilton, so even early on, the Founding Fathers acknowledged that the business of politics is business. So there's this nexus in between what we want business to do in society, but that government wants to try to influence that or shape that, and vice versa. So as we talked about, the business leaders are the principal decision makers in the market, and we'll review that one more time. And then lastly, this ultimate point we're going to get to, and that is businesses then come to politicians. So politicians want business to do things, but then businesses want politicians to do things, particularly to remove risk from their investments. But we'll go into that in detail. So if you remember this model of the economy that we unpacked when we were talking about the economy, how you have the 3 stages: investment, production, exchange, how the worker brings their brain bronze and experience to the investment stage, puts it into action in the production stage, adding value to all those resources, twisting the widgets until you have something that's more valuable than what you started with. They give that to the entrepreneur in exchange for a paycheck, and that person gets to walk away with the paycheck. The entrepreneur, on the other hand, takes their own brain bronze and experience and then captures that of many others, labor, puts it all together with site, location, tools, natural resources, and of course the money necessary to make that all happen, buy it all, pay for it, at least in its first cycle. In the production stage, they manage that to make sure that that value is added. And then in the exchange, they do 2 exchanges. One with the employees to get the product for them. They give the employees a paycheck. But then to take that to market, that product to market, and exchange it with consumers for a profit. And then all workers and entrepreneurs get to take that profit and paycheck, and they get to use it in one of 4 ways, or all 4 ways for that matter. Consumption, consume it now to buy the things that they need for life and living. Savings, which economists often view as delayed consumption, just to use it later. Taxes, of course, paying to the government, give to Caesar, as unto Caesar, and then also charity or philanthropy. All right? So this is the economy. All right? One of the things that we talked about, and we talked about Keynesianism, and that is that typically in a market system, we leave the investment decisions and much of this circulation of the economy to the relationship between entrepreneurs and consumers. So business and consumers, buyers and suppliers, or suppliers and buyers, to keep the order right. So it's private individuals that are handling all this. Well, Keynesian, or Alan Maynard Keynes, came in with the idea right around the Great Depression, right before the Great Depression, which FDR put into practice on the onset of Great Depression, that government can do this or make this investment decision as well. But here's the thing. If government is making this investment, let's just say energy production, government makes an investment in solar panels, the entrepreneurs, the private individuals who are making the investment in natural gas, see this government investment as competition. So now the government has come in and is now competing, if you will, in a similar product, in the similar marketplace, the energy marketplace, if you will, with the private individuals. And so one aspect of government can be competition, or one aspect of regulation, because that's literally what we call it, it's the same activity area, might actually result in competition. And the real question is, do we want that competition? Do we want the government to be doing those things, that involvement, or do we want that involvement to center around or be primarily the realm of and decided by private individuals, and the relationship specifically between suppliers and buyers? Just going real quickly, put it in context. We saw this already, strengths and weaknesses of each of these economic models. You have traditional systems, command systems, market systems. Command systems, which is where the government would be doing, directing the investment, can be very equitable, meaning the government can make sure that the outcomes are equal. They can be predictable, they can change direction very quickly, but they're also weak in the sense that they're not going to lead the way in innovation. They tend to be inefficient as well. So there's going to be a lot of waste along the way in terms of spending and production. Whereas the market, if you leave it to private individuals, is going to be very efficient, going to be very dynamic. It enforces itself. It doesn't need a whole lot of hand-holding or supervision or oversight. But it's not going to be equitable. And so you get this dichotomy. Even in the terms of providing a private good product, if you will, an individual product, what outcome? Who do you want directing it towards? What outcome do you want with that provision? So government regulation can be seen as a good or bad thing, depending on your perspective and what you want. But from the interest group perspective, it's going to be seen as a bad thing. The business interest groups do not want the government to regulate, or at least do not want the government to invest, to take command, if you will, of an economic enterprise or even an industry, because that crowds them out. That's more competition that they have to face, and that's less, if you will, room for their activity. So if government is in, then that's less room for businesses to do it. Just putting those, again, reminding us of some of this we covered already, putting the direction of the economy along with the ownership of the resources in the economy, that's where you get the isms. Capitalism pairs with a market system the private ownership of the means of production. So not only do individuals make the decision of how that market moves, or I should make the decision of how that economy moves, the individuals own the production. They own all the resources that go into that. In a Marxist or socialist system, Marxism would have that the government not only directs it, but owns it. In that way, they can maintain control and make sure that the outcomes are equitable. Socialism, what you see in most European countries, is going to be some mix of that. And so we remember the example of France, where 70%, 68% to be technical, of all output in the economy was generated by government, which is to say 70% of all production was owned and effectively distributed, directed and distributed by government. And then, of course, we talked about Keynesian and its role in that. All right? So regulation first, the one aspect to think about regulation as competition, and interest groups tend to see that as bad. Business interest groups do not want the government as a competitor to their private enterprise activities. All right? So regulation as competition is undesirable to most businesses. Now you have this idea of regulation as subsidy. Okay? Again, and this is why it gets so confusing. This is the same term. So when you're talking or reading an article in the newspaper, talking with your friends, listening to sound bites by different groups, they're going to use the same term, regulation. But what are they talking about? What activity are they talking about? Well, now we're going to talk about regulation as a subsidy. We talked about it as competition. So what I have here, this title, Collective Action Problem of Business. And really, it's more about the collective action problem of the economy. And what do I mean by that? The collective action problem, of course, centers around what public good do we want, all right? What public good do we want provided? What's that thing we want everybody to benefit from and nobody to be excluded from? Well, in the economy, the thing we want everybody to benefit from, or one thing we want everybody to benefit from, is goods and services. We want stuff. I know y'all might remember this. We covered this in the previous lecture. The other thing we want jobs. We want to work. Give me a job. Good night. We want that so badly. All right? But who produces those jobs? Again, in our market system, who produces those jobs? Who makes the decisions that would, quote unquote, offer jobs that would ultimately result in more goods and services? Well, businesses do. Why do businesses do it then? Well, we know. They do it to gain a profit. They don't do it out of the benefit of the charity of their own hearts. They do it, and maybe they do. Maybe they want to benefit the society in providing goods and services as well as jobs. But nevertheless, what motivates that for them personally, why do they make the personal sacrifice, why do they put all that sweat and equity, why do they do all that they do it for the profit. But it's not without risk. The risk of financial ruin. See, that's the difference, I would argue, between most workers and their financial situation and most entrepreneurs and their financial situation. Workers, yes, they face the possibility of losing their job. And that's not good. No one wants to lose their job. But if you lose your job, all the stuff you've purchased before you had that job, you still have. Your ability to go and find another job, you still have. An entrepreneur, let's say you put $100,000 into an enterprise. That $100,000 might represent a second mortgage on your house, might represent your kid's college fund. If that business doesn't succeed, you lose all of that $100,000. That means you don't have the money for that second mortgage. That means you don't have your kid's college fund. That risk of financial ruin is significant, and it keeps a lot of people on the sidelines of this entrepreneurial type activity. And so what businesses often seek from government, as I said in an earlier slide, is they want government to help reduce that risk. And one way that government can help reduce that risk is to guarantee the income. This slide here, if you remember, we did this business model, right? For any enterprise, they have a business model. Their income minus their expenses will lead to their net equity, or what's left over. If positive net equity, then that in a for-profit company, that can leave the company and go into the owner's pockets. So that goes into the owner's pockets as profit. That's where profit comes from. It's what's left over from the income, from the revenues, what you sell, minus what you pay to produce that thing, and that's your leftover, your net equity. All right? So that's that. One way that government can, quote unquote, take away the risk from my enterprise is guarantee me a contract. Government, you be the buyer for my product. And notice that, and the other thing about, or benefit, one of the benefits of government being your buyer, is government is pretty regular. It's been around for a good little while. It's going to be around for a good little longer while. As long as we have society, we have government. As long as we have government, we're going to have taxes. As long as we have taxes, government's going to have the ability to pay the bill for my services. See the regularity of that? See how that might reduce risk? I have a guaranteed customer here, effectively, as long as I can keep that government contract. Tax breaks are a way to reduce risk because it lowers my expenses. Now, if I don't have to pay property taxes for the first 5 years of my business, less expenditure, even if I'm not making as much money because this business just started, nevertheless, I'm not spending as much, hey, I have a guaranteed profit, or at least a much more likelihood of earning a profit. Loan guarantees are much the same way, in the sense that they remove the risk from the bank who would lend me money. So loan guarantees are just that. That's where the government says to the lending associations, we will pay for those loans if the business fails. Yes, that happens. I know, you can't get a loan guarantee for your mortgage. Wish you could. But businesses, on the other hand, oftentimes can get the government to guarantee their loans. And the government likes to do loan guarantees because technically they don't spend any money. If the business succeeds, hey, we didn't pay anything. Bank get the proceeds, the revenue of the income of the business, pays the bank for their lending. We're all good. And so loan guarantees are relatively cheap until the business fails. Then the government's on the hook. But nevertheless, loan guarantees, you see how it can reduce risk because it makes the bank more willing to lend, and therefore the business can get the capital that it needs to move forward. And then there are a whole host of regulations that can either increase the cost, which is interesting, increase the cost of operations or even lower the cost of operations. Obviously, if you lower the cost of operations, that helps. But some businesses might actually ask for higher costs of operation, meaning more regulations that increase the cost and make it more expensive to operate. Who might that be? That would be those large margin enterprises, meaning if this difference between my revenue and my expenses is large, like I got a big margin, I can make a whole lot, there's a whole lot left over, then I might be willing to lose some of that to drive out my competition, those who do not have such a large margin. So for example, if I got, I make 20 cents off of every dollar of investment, I might be willing to drop 5 cents if that drops out my competitors who only make 10 cents off of every dollar. Because then they drop out, I get more of that market. Now I'm making more of that 20% or even 15 cents because we've increased the cost of regulations. And hey, I'm good. I've actually made more money by more volume now that we've kicked out these other businesses. And then lastly, stimulus. Like the automakers out of Detroit. When that industry took a big hit in the 2008 crisis, still kind of unsure why the crisis hit the auto industry as much as it hit, or was that the 2001 crisis? Forgive me if I'm confusing. But nevertheless, the point is, your professors are not all perfect. Anyway, the point is that when the industry falls on hard time, they can come to the government and say, hey, we provide tons of jobs, which is exactly what the auto industry does. Michigan will die if you don't rescue us. Indiana and all the companies and states that support industries that make products that go into cars will die if you don't bail us out. And you know what happened? Government bailed them out. Now you say, well, that's a good thing, right? You preserve the jobs. Yeah, but what happened in the business that caused them to lose that in the first place? Meaning, was that just an accident, if you will, of circumstance? Or was it bad behavior on the part of business leaders making decisions that didn't bring a positive outcome and therefore, and then just falling back on the government to say, but all these jobs are going to be lost. Y'all come bail them out. There's a positive way to look at it. There's a negative way to look at it in the sense of what actually caused that industry failure in the first place before you even got to the bailout. As economists would tell you, some businesses and industries should fail. If consumers no longer want that product, or if it's not being produced in an efficient way, it should fail. So then why would the government be bailing it out? They would say that they shouldn't. But nevertheless, all of this is a way that regulations, government activity, same type of a label that we use even on the competition, the investment side, now government is subsidizing, if you will. They're taking away the risk. They're making it more likely that these private individuals, when they put their money on the line, will actually receive, or will actually succeed, and therefore receive that profit, and therefore continue that activity. And why do they do it? Again, because we all want stuff. We all want jobs. And so government will pay a little bit, if you will, to make sure that the rest of us get the stuff and the jobs that we want. So, regulations as subsidy. So we talked about regulations as competition, talked about regulation as subsidy. Here's the last one. Regulations as enforcement. I'm sorry. My slides are not, there we go. Regulation as enforcement of cooperation. And this actually we covered a little bit when we talked about the economy, but obviously we're digging deep here. All right? So regulations as enforcement of cooperation. What do I mean by that? Let me explain. So I got to introduce a concept to you. This is a concept from Michael Porter, Porter's Five Forces. Porter is a business scholar. Put this forth in the 1980s. I'm citing it from a 2008 article. But effectively characterizing what a business leader has to do, or the entities of the business relationships, that's the best way to explain it, that a business leader has to manage in order to make sure that they make money. All right? So in not just in their internal operations, the investment, production, and exchange, but even surrounding it. How do they have to relate to the world around them in order to make sure that they make money? Well, the number one thing they have to relate to is existing competitors. So again, one of the reasons why businesses don't like government as an investor or government as competition is because they don't want competitors. I mean, if I have a corner, if I have a monopoly on the market, I can make more money. If I'm the only one providing a good and service, I can make all the money from providing their good and service. So they have to manage that relationship with their competitors. All right. They also have to manage relationship with the suppliers, which could be labor, even supply of the human resources, human effort, strength, and creativity and experience that goes into making their products. They have to manage their relationships with the consumers, those who buy the products, keeping them happy, keeping them satisfied, keeping them wanting more. And then they have to manage the threat of substitute goods and services. So I like the solar panel versus the natural gas example, because though they both produce energy, they're different products. And so someone producing natural gas, yes, has to worry about other natural gas producers, but also have to worry about those who are producing solar power. Because they meet the same need in the marketplace. They're substitute goods. And then they have to worry about new entrants, who could come in as competition to face me. All right? So all of these are different relationships, external relationships, if you will, that a business has to manage. And here's the problem. One of the reasons why I love focusing on collective dilemmas. There's a prisoner's dilemma involved with all of these relationships. Remember prisoner's dilemma, two actors trying to relate to each other, trying to cooperate. If they cooperate, they get this medium outcome where everyone is benefited to an extent, but that medium outcome is often not pursued because each actor thinks that they can not cooperate while getting the other actor to cooperate, and therefore that actor that doesn't cooperate makes the most. Well, business with all these relationships can attempt the same thing. They can attempt to not cooperate with labor by not paying labor the true value that the labor adds to the production process. So if I can get away with keeping labor uninformed and paying them less, then of course as a business I can make more. But if I pay the labor well, up to their value, I still make money and they make more money, and everyone's more benefited, if you will. There's a medium outcome. I don't make as much, but they make more. There's a medium outcome. But I can fudge that, again, prisoner's dilemma. If I don't cooperate, they do cooperate, meaning they keep working for me, but they make less, and then I make that more. I'm more benefited. Prisoner's dilemma. Consumers, we see it a lot, especially when we see businesses selling products that they know are faulty or have problems with them. The airbag recall. That company that was putting the airbags in those cars knew that the airbags would explode suddenly without warning and not in an accident. And they knew that there were metal pieces in that airbag, meaning when the compartment that held the airbag exploded, some of the metal pieces would actually fly off into the explosion. So the airbag that's supposed to save you in an accident could potentially kill you in an accident. And they knew that, but they sold it anyway. Again, getting the consumers to cooperate by buying it, but them not cooperating by not giving them a safe and quality product because they can save money if they don't. If I don't pay to fix that, just let it go anyway, hey, I make more money. Yeah, I might, and even if I get found out, I'll pay a little bit less, a little bit more later on. That's just the price of doing business. Again, prisoner's dilemma. It helps explain it. We see it even with external society, if you will. Think about the emissions, air quality emissions. And so I'm spewing out emissions all in the air. The air quality is diminishing precipitously. Folks is dying, the water is getting contaminated, kids are dying from drinking the water from their faucet. But I'm paying less as a business leader. I'm paying less as the manufacturing plant operator that's producing that waste and dumping it out into the rivers and into the air. So again, not cooperating. If I paid it and built that fee into the price of the product and it was all cleaned up and it was all safe and sound, then hey, everyone's healthy, no one's health is damaged, and I make still a profit, but I don't make as much. Again, prisoner's dilemma. It's, to me, I praise God for this because this insight, because this is the number one way that we talk about business being dirty. Some people just have this innate understanding that sometimes it can be tough to, that's my wife, gotta love her. It can be tough to run a business. It can be tough to handle all that type of relationship and still be Christian, because you got this profit motive over here that's egging you on, if you will, towards some behavior that may not be the most Christian, in the sense of may not be the best example of loving your neighbor, best application of loving your neighbor. And so yes, business, if you will operate a business, you will be faced with many opportunities to not love your neighbor, to literally take advantage of your neighbor. And I would argue, especially, and funniest thing is, I'm not the only one to have recognized this. Most business schools now have a corporate ethics or business ethics course.